for...
I mean, that was just that. We were so lucky that they brought some duck yesterday.
Oh, yes, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Did you see somebody walking around with a pet duck? Yeah.
Soon after the United States declared war against the United Kingdom on June 18, 1812, spirited American troops began assembling at Greenbush on the upper Hudson River, directly opposite Albany, New York. From this staging area, confident detachments eager for victory marched north to strategic points along the Canadian border. The 3rd Regiment of Artillery, commanded by Colonel Alexander Macomb, was one such unit. Like many of his men, this enthusiastic commander was determined to see unfinished business from the Revolutionary War completed, namely, the end of British masterdom in Canada. Following a 13-day trek through mud and mire, snow and cold, and sometimes hostile inhabitants, Macomb and his men slogged into Sackett's Harbour, a cold and miserable place on Lake Ontario. Unknown to many, this cold and miserable place was destined to become the largest and most important American outpost during the War of 1812. Thousands of troops, tailors, shipwrights, and teamsters converged on this frontier village to create the nation's most powerful fleet and launch offensives to secure the conquest of British North America. Macomb optimistically predicted,
"Our next affair will be a fight between the fleets. The General Pike, the new ship, is fast fitting out for sea, and when she is completed, a grand naval fight will decide the campaign."
However, in war, perhaps more than elsewhere in human affairs, events unfold differently from that of expectations. Britain responded forcefully to thwart America's ambitions, and by the end of 1813, events turned against these would-be conquerors of Canada. This frontier village thereafter became the bulwark in defending the northern frontier. This dramatic turn of events can best be understood in view of Sackett's Harbour's geography and the milestone battle on May 29, 1813. To understand, we begin in 1801, where the powerful Black River forces its way into eastern Lake Ontario.
There, a harbour is found, a harbour which is sheltered from winds and surges of the lake that soar like those of the ocean. A peninsula of limestone rock perfectly protects a sheet of water containing about 10 acres. The land fronting this bay is raised about 30 feet, and when seen from the water, these cliffs resemble the walls of an ancient fortification.
This is the earliest description of what was shortly to evolve into a new frontier village. That same year, Augustus Sackett, a New York City land speculator, learned of this deep, sheltered harbour on the edge of the primeval forests and travelled there to personally inspect it. Impressed by what he found, Sackett pushed back to New York and secured title to a tract of land surrounding the harbour. Gathering a few hardy settlers, he returned to find a new settlement which was christened Mr. Sackett's Village. He built a refined and comfortable Georgian residence facing the harbour on Black River Bay and made plans to erect a church on the limestone bluff that resembled an ancient fortification. Augustus Sackett, born in New York City in 1769 and later died in 1827, studied law and became a land speculator focusing mainly on tracts of land on or near the eastern shores of Lake Ontario, purchasing a tract of land containing 16,500 acres. Subsequently, in 1801, Sackett disposed of his business interests in New York City and moved with his wife to the harbour. In 1805, a number of English colonists settled there as well. The federal government created a U.S. revenue district and appointed Sackett its first tax collector. In 1806, the township of Hounsfield, which embraced the village, held its first town meeting, and Sackett was elected its first supervisor. In 1807, Sackett was elected Jefferson County's first judge. However, 2 years later, Sackett disposed of all his holdings in Jefferson County and moved again, this time to Jamaica, Long Island, and then again in 1812 Sackett moved to Meadville, Pennsylvania, where he once again purchased several hundred acres of land. Sackett, the nomad that he was, returned to New York City shortly thereafter and then in 1820 moved to Rutherford County, North Carolina, having become interested in a large tract of land there. Within a few years he once again became interested in land within the 1,000 islands of the St. Lawrence River and returned to Sackett's Harbour. Sackett lost money in these transactions and died from a sudden illness while en route from Newburgh to Sackett's Harbour in April 1827, in the 59th year of his life. The sheltered nature of the new settlement, its viability as a port amidst primitive overland routes, and the fertility of the soil attracted newcomers. The summers were pleasant and enjoyable, but short. Land speculators, however, failed to mention the brutality of the winters, which could last almost half a year. Newcomers from relatively temperate New England quickly discovered what real cold and snow were, and, as time went on, only the most hardy remained. Nevertheless, growth of the little village was steady. By 1802, a traveller reported some 30 families living in the wilderness in and around the newly settled harbour. An advertisement in the Columbian Gazette of Utica described the surrounding land as excellent and an alluring goal for hard-working newcomers. Eventually, thousands of settlers from New England and eastern New York sought lands in the northern and western section of the state. This expanse was formerly inhabited by the Iroquois, many of whom fled to Upper Canada after the Revolutionary War. The population of qualified voters in the township rose from a few dozen in 1801 to 226 by 1807, and by 1810 amounted to 943. Slowly carved out of the forests, Sackett's Harbour developed into a village of elegant, modern-built houses and outbuildings, generally superior to the older communities left behind to the east.
From the bluff overlooking the lake, the distant islands, the Marriott of peninsulas and outlets of rivers are also beautiful, and the scene is continually enlivened with vessels and boats, while the wharves, warehouses and stores exhibit an appearance very much resembling a seaport back east.
Sackett's Harbour was not the only settlement founded in northern New York, as thousands of land-hungry settlers poured into what became Jefferson County. About 8 miles distant on the Black River, Brownville was also developing into a lively village. In 1798, the brothers Samuel and Jacob Brown, Pennsylvania Quakers, purchased land from the Chassanis Company on which their community was established. The first member of the family to settle there was Jacob, who arrived at the Black River country in February 1799. This Jacob Brown was a tall, handsome, and resourceful man destined to emerge as one of the most famous field commanders of the War of 1812. At an early age, his father suffered financial reverses, and the young Quaker tried his hand at a number of activities. He taught school briefly before moving to the Ohio Territory to work as a land surveyor. Finding the reality of frontier life less alluring than advertised, Brown returned to teaching in New York City and subsequently turned his attention to law. He abandoned this, too, in favor of writing political essays and avidly studying history. To hone his oratory skills, Brown joined a debating society and soon became a prominent member. It is asserted, but cannot be documented, that prior to settling in northern New York, Brown was employed as a military secretary under Alexander Hamilton during the quasi-war with France in 1798. Under Brown's wise leadership, his clan transformed its wilderness hamlet into a prosperous community. Brown, his father and brothers opened a store, built mills, and began producing potash for the willing market in British North America. Here it could be sold and manufactured into gunpowder for use in the Napoleonic Wars raging in Europe. The Browns soon established a flourishing trade in flour, potash, and pearl ashes with the city of Kingston in Upper Canada, as well as Montreal and Quebec City. Business was good despite primitive transportation. It was possible to journey from Brownsville or Sackett's Harbour as far as Kingston by boat in one day, and round-trip to Montreal in about 1 week. Other settlements continued rising. Southwest of Sackett's Harbour, on the shore of Lake Ontario, lay the neighbouring frontier port of Oswego. Situated at the mouth of the Oswego River, it was America's doorway to the interior of a vast unsettled continent and connected New York City to the Great Lakes via the Hudson and Mohawk rivers and a vast myriad of lakes north to the port of Oswego. Oswego's strategic location also attracted settlement and commerce. A British trading post was built there as early as 1727, and later other forts were erected on either side of the Oswego River's mouth. Oswego was the scene of bloody fighting during the French and Indian Wars, from 1754 to 1763, and was briefly under French control. It functioned as a staging area for the powerful British offensive against Montreal in 1760. Recognizing Oswego's importance, Britain violated the 1783 Treaty of Paris and retained a post there until 1796. A decade later, the flourishing little port of about 40 dwellings could boast shipbuilding capabilities along with a profitable salt trade carried on with other Great Lake centres. American development of the southern shore of the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario was paralleled by British settlement to the north and west in Upper Canada. By 1800, the village of Kingston, 36 miles distant from Sackett's Harbour, had already developed into the largest community on Lake Ontario. Established on the site of the former French fort, known as Frontenac. Kingston developed as a result of the transfer of the Crown military facilities from nearby Carleton Island. This had been Britain's most important military post in the Great Lakes system during the Revolutionary War. But because the 1783 peace treaty ending the Revolutionary War placed the boundary between British North America and the United States in the middle of the Great Lakes and down the St. Lawrence River through its main channel, Carleton Island fell into American territory. During that war, the Crown constructed a dockyard, supply base and fort on the island. Indian and Loyalists, raids were launched against the American rebels, and uprooted Loyalists sought refuge there. After the Revolution, the British kept a small garrison on the island, refusing access to Americans. By the end of the 1780s, troops, dockyard workers, naval personnel, Loyalists and Indians resettled at Kingston, taking advantage of its excellent harbour. Over the course of the 1790s, a rapid increase in population took place as refugee Loyalists and American settlers seeking cheap Crown lands converged on this new settlement, building houses, grist and sawmills. By 1806, Kingston contained barracks, a hospital, storehouses, an Anglican church, and about 150 dwellings. 4 years later, the new village had one of the largest newspapers in Canada, the Kingston Gazette, and a thriving shipyard. Kingston, like Sackett's Harbour, prospered from growing trade on Lake Ontario. Being situated at both the head of the lake and the source of the St. Lawrence River, Kingston was also the main base of the Provincial Marine. The Provincial Marine was a small offshoot of the Quartermaster's Department, used to transport troops and supplies to British garrisons throughout the Great Lakes. A position in the Provincial Marine required little or no effort, as captains of its vessels were aging septuagenarians with limited combat experience. 2 new warships, the Duke of Kent and the armed schooner Duke of Gloucester, were built to augment those constructed during and shortly after the Revolutionary War. Lake seamen enlisted as volunteers and were trained in naval gunnery. In 1809, a 22-gun corvette, Royal George, was launched. She was the largest ship of war built on the freshwater interior of North America, and a stern reminder of British military presence. Most Americans, however, blissfully ignored military developments and focused their attention on lucrative commercial concerns. One newspaper observed how
Upper Canada was considered the most temperate climate as well as the most fertile soil, belonging to the British in Canada.
the rapid improvements in agriculture and the advancement of manufactures are justly attributed to the activity and enterprise of the American farmers, who from grants of Crown lands have been induced to settle in great numbers in that province. Indeed, Upper Canada would be considered as a territory belonging to the United States from the immense difference which exists between the industry of its inhabitants and those of Lower Canada, French-speaking Quebec, from their manners, habits, and appearance, and from the value of their farms and the luxurious appearance of their crops. As the border communities consolidated and grew in population, trade between them boomed. Soon, scheduled travel between Sackett's Harbour and Kingston was arranged. Upwards of 40 small merchant schooners were built on Lake Ontario to carry wheat, flour, beef, pork, lumber, and other commodities to Canada. There these commodities were traded for quality British manufactured goods, difficult or impossible to procure on the American frontier. Inevitably, such a flourishing business attracted the attention of revenue-hungry Washington, and in 1803, Sackett's Harbour was designated the sole customs port between Oswego on Lake Ontario and Ogdensburg, which was situated on the southern bank of the St. Lawrence River, southwest of Montreal. Augustus Sackett, the most prominent local member of the community, was appointed the first customs agent of the newly established Sackett's Harbour District. In time, however, the threat of war between the United States and Great Britain overshadowed the prospects of continual prosperity between the harbour and the other peaceful border communities. Mounting tension between the two nations resulted from the very treaty which ended the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris, because it failed to establish a route to develop amicable relations between the United States and Great Britain. Both countries violated terms of the treaty, and, in particular, the Crown, who refused to relinquish her posts on the northern territory of the new republic, including Oswego, until Jay's Treaty of 1794 brought a temporary lessening of antagonism. One clause stipulated that Great Britain would withdraw her forces from these posts. The Crown did obey treaty stipulations, with the exception of Carleton Island. It was a minor sticking point, but greater friction arose on the northwestern frontier of the then United States. As the pioneers pushed westward, the Indians of the Old Northwest formed a confederacy to resist white encroachments. Determined to defend their land, the tribes appealed to their former ally, Great Britain, for assistance. The British were careful to appear neutral in the resulting conflict, but many Americans suspected British sympathies lay with the Indians and secretly encouraged the uprising. A more serious irritant arose from the World War Britain had waged ceaselessly against France since 1793. This conflict created a demand in Europe among both belligerents for American raw materials. Consequently, the American merchant marine experienced phenomenal growth, and, since the need for crews could not be met at home, American carriers began drawing on the skilled human resources of Britain. It is estimated that, in the first decade of the 19th century, between 15,000 and 20,000 British sailors deserted the Royal Navy, many to sign on with American merchant ships. Not only was treatment more humane, but they were also fed, paid, and berthed in better conditions. Britain acted decisively to prevent the hemorrhaging of trained seamen, both from her navy and merchant marine. Her warships actively stopped American flag vessels under the right of search, and impressed any sailors they suspected to be British. Although American seamen were issued identification papers, the Royal Navy often refused to recognize them, and, according to official complaints lodged with the Department of State, 6,257 American citizens were impressed into the Royal Navy prior to April of 1812. Washington City made strenuous efforts to get them back, but many Americans languished in the lower decks of His Majesty's warships for years. In the course of developments, America became caught between both belligerents, as both Britain and France passed decrees forbidding neutral nations from trading with the other. Since the Royal Navy ruled the waves, the British prohibition, the 1807 Orders in Council, weighed more heavily on the United States than did those of France. British warships enforced the orders, and violators were subject to seizure. Congress, at the behest of President Thomas Jefferson, enacted an embargo in 1807 stipulating that no clearance should be issued to American-flagged vessels bound for any foreign port. It was a ploy intended to force the warring powers of Europe to show greater respect for the rights of neutrals and to keep the United States from becoming entangled in a foreign war. The results were both predictable and unsavory. American cotton, tobacco, and other goods rotted on wharves. The merchant marine was laid up, seamen were unemployed, and prices plummeted. The American economy went into a recession in 1808, for which public sentiment blamed Britain. The Embargo Act, designed to keep the United States out of war, only succeeded in pushing her to the brink. The embargo applied equally to the Great Lakes as well as the Atlantic trade, and succeeded in dashing the prosperity of northern New York border settlements. Not surprisingly, smuggling, especially of potash, became rampant. The illegality of exporting it from American ports led to extensive and systematic measures to transport it to Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. This commodity fetched between $200 and $300 per ton in Montreal, and from that city there was no obstacle in exporting it to England. In an effort to evade the embargo, Americans transported potash and other goods which sometimes vanished in the night, or were transported with due formality to Ogdensburg, where they simply disappeared, or were shipped in open defiance of the law. Naturally, these commodities were sure to magically reappear in Montreal at great profit to those transporting them. To check this illegal trade, the state and federal governments took the unpopular step of stationing troops at Sackett's Harbour and other northern ports. In August 1808, matters reached a boiling point when the customs collector in Oswego seized a shipment of Canadian flour that had been smuggled into the port. A few days later, 60 armed men boldly announced their intention to recapture the flour. They swaggered through the town, uttering threats that they intended to attack the customs house, clear out the town or burn it. The collector sent a courier to alert a troop of New York State militia dragoons, stationed nearby. The unit commander saddled his outfit and rode toward Oswego. Upon hearing the sounds of galloping horses, the insurrectionists fled into the nearby woods and made their way home as best they could. New York's military-minded governor, Daniel Tompkins, believed it was necessary to
suppress the existing insurrection and to aid the collector to carry into effect the laws of the United States against the armed and violent resistance made at the port of Oswego.
As commander-in-chief of the state militia, Tompkins ordered a detachment to Oswego to protect the port from any new outbreaks of violence, emphasizing that,
if it should be found impractical to reclaim from their errors those deluded citizens who have wickedly indulged themselves in violations of their civil obligations by armed and forcible opposition to the execution of the laws, then force must be employed to rescue the insulted laws from violence of these offenders, to suppress the existing insurrection, and to prevent any armed or forcible arrest and removal of vessels or property legally detained or seized by the collector of the district of Oswego.
The same month at Sackett's Harbour, Hart Massey replaced Sackett as customs agent. During the next winter on March 14, 1809, a distressed Massey reported,
Nature has furnished the smugglers with the firmest ice that was ever known on this frontier.
The sleighs of the smugglers passed Sackett's Harbour 10 miles from shore, and available forces were insufficient to stop them. Smugglers were determined to evade the laws even at the risk of their lives. At Ogdensburg, they even conspired not to allow government forces to be stationed in that. The smugglers threatened that if any officer of the law should interfere, they would take a raw hide to them.
These threats do not terrify me,
Massey laconically remarked.
I only mention them to let you know their unprincipled determination.
The smugglers and the militia stationed there to patrol the border eventually developed a mutual understanding. The inexperienced troops simply looked the other way and, in turn, were left alone. Normally, the militia assigned to patrol duties received little training and served only short periods of time. Their officers were political appointees, and when they did turn out for duty, it amounted to little more than political rallies, parades, and days of drinking. Massey found it almost impossible to get any assistance from the intimidated militia to move confiscated contraband to government storage. He felt if he did not have his own armed men with him, the inhabitants would assemble in the night and take the property. Some people supported the law, but were fearful of fulfilling their legal obligations. Massey exclaimed,
My life and the lives of my deputies are threatened daily. What will be the fate of us, God only knows.
Jacob Brown of Brownville was supposedly one of the foremost of these smugglers. A trail known as Brown's Smugglers' Road was cut through the forest from the Black River to French Creek and north towards the St. Lawrence River. This route became a major thoroughfare for smugglers making their way to Canada. Brown plied his illicit trade so diligently that he accrued considerable wealth and acquired the inglorious title of Potash Brown, a nickname his future enemies would revel in. Intelligent and enterprising, Brown not only developed his family's new settlement, but in 1809 also managed to secure appointment as Lieutenant Colonel Commandant of the newly formed 108th Infantry Regiment of the New York Militia. In 1811, Governor Tompkins was searching for a suitable candidate to fill the vacant position of Brigadier General on the vulnerable northern frontier. Because political infighting cancelled out two leading contenders, Tompkins decided to appoint 36-year-old Brown instead. Many felt the governor's choice was a good one as Brown maintained an active interest in military affairs. Brown wanted a militia capable of effective active service, but could he get it on the frontier where many settlers were also part-time smugglers? On the contrary, in order to remain popular with the local militia, Brown limited expenditure of time and money for parades and other time-consuming musters. This was a difficult balancing act for, in a frontier society, planting and harvesting crops, clearing forests and building adequate shelter were foremost on people's minds. The last thing the rank and file of the militia wanted to do was waste time on what many considered frivolous military service. The federal government struggled to cope with the smuggling crisis by sending more troops north and building a warship at Oswego. This task was given to 26-year-old Lieutenant Mellington T. Woolsey of the U.S. Navy, who received orders to superintend the construction of the gun brig on Lake Ontario and two gunboats on Lake Champlain. Woolsey, a Navy career officer since 1800, had already distinguished himself in the quasi-war with France and the Tripolitan Wars. Military service seemed to run through Woolsey's family. His father had been a prominent but controversial officer in the Revolution, and his mother was a member of the powerful Livingston family. Woolsey's grandfather had been an officer in the British Army during the French and Indian War and was killed in the campaign against the French at Ticonderoga. Young Woolsey, attentive to detail and capable of following instructions implicitly, was an ideal choice for this arduous task. Before departing New York City for Oswego, Lieutenant Woolsey notified the Navy Department that it was impossible to secure good workmen and most building materials on Lake Ontario. He had learned that even the British were compelled to hire carpenters from the New York shipyards to work at Kingston. Woolsey sought to ease his task by contracting noted ship designer Christian Berg and master builder Henry Eckford, for they are said to be the most faithful workmen. Born and raised in the shipbuilding region of Hamburg, Germany, Christian Berg had earned a reputation as one of New York's leading shipbuilders because of his advanced designs and the quality of his vessel. The 33-year-old Scottish-born Eckford began his trade in the shipyards of Quebec under the apprenticeship of his uncle, the eminent naval builder John Black. By age 21, Eckford left Canada and owned his own shipyard in New York. He was soon recognized as one of the foremost shipbuilders in that city, and his carpenters were considered among the best available. Woolsey closed the contract and began what was to become a long and enduring shipbuilding relationship with Henry Eckford. On August 6, 1808, Lieutenant Woolsey, a sailing master, Thomas Gamble of the U.S. Navy, departed New York City for Oswego, followed by Eckford and a gang of workmen. They were later joined by midshipman James Fenimore Cooper, a young man with a literary bent. Wolsey and Gamble reached their destination on the evening of the 12th, while Eckford and company arrived the following morning. He brooked no delay in organising his men to construct quarters and prepare a dockyard on which to frame the gun brig. Wolsey, however, was alarmed by military conditions at Oswego because it lacked a garrison of regulars. Much concerned, he wrote superiors that
there is much to be apprehended from the turbulent spirit of the people in that part of the country who are infringing on the embargo laws,
and suggested that a detachment of Marines be sent to protect the dockyard. The young officer was also singularly unimpressed by Oswego, which he described as
a rather dreary place, perfectly destitute of genteel society, many of the necessities and all of the luxuries of life. Gamble, Cooper, and myself are, however, tolerably well quartered, and in hopes with what we shall be able to procure from the east to weather out this winter pretty comfortably. Mr. Gamble, Cooper, and myself yet enjoy good health, for this is the most dreary hole at this season I ever saw.
Under Eckford's aegis, progress on the gun brig was rapid, and by September, Wolsey reported that most of her timbers were prepared, while the keel and top timbers were of the best white oak. Early winter found the brig's frame complete, planking had begun, and the rigging, rails, cables, and anchors were en route from New York. Wolsey also requested permission to replace the heavy 32-pound-long gun planned for the new vessel with two much lighter 24-pounder short-barreled carronades. A skilled sailor, he feared its weight would render the brig truly laboursome for this lake, as the sea here is much shorter than on the ocean. Confessing he initially sought to mount a heavy gun in the bow, he now doubted its practicality, for there was not a more ferocious sea in the world than Lake Ontario. He worried the brig would be swamped in heavy seas, so lighter armament was more practical. Wolsey was also concerned about Oswego's viability as a base for the new vessel. During the summer months, the level of Lake Ontario fell, making it risky for the deep-draughted brig to sail because of a shifting sandbar in the river mouth. Upon investigating, he discovered there were only two anchorages on the American side of the lake, Sackett's Harbour and the Niagara River, which could accommodate his vessel. Eckford's carpenters made swift progress, and the new brig was launched March 31st, 1809. A proud Wolsey described her as
the handsomest vessel in the navy.
Since he had received no instructions what to name her, he decided to proclaim it Oneida, after the country in which she was built, a lake in the vicinity of this place, and a nation of Indians that inhabit the border of it. Shortly thereafter, Wolsey sailed to Sackett's Harbour to explore the possibility of establishing a navy yard there. He reported the peninsula, forming the harbour, had from 10 to 13 feet of water, and was within 150 yards of the place best suited for a public dock. Wolsey also observed that the limestone cliffs resembling the walls of an ancient fortification dominated the harbour and bay. Here, he believed a battery could be built to mount the brig's guns in winter. Wolsey concluded,
I think it is the only place suitable on the American side for establishing a navy yard.
By December 1810, the Oneida and its skeleton crew were transferred to Sackett's Harbour with orders to suppress smuggling and conduct other revenue duties. Wolsey thereupon commenced building a guardroom, a boathouse, and a mess room to accommodate his charge. Augustus Sackett's plan to build a church on the bluff never materialized, and his sheltered anchorage was slowly evolving into the U.S. naval headquarters on Lake Ontario. As Wolsey busied himself, the United States and Britain continued their inexorable drift towards war. American passions were further inflamed in 1807 by the Chesapeake incident. The British warship HMS Leopard encountered the USS Chesapeake off the Virginia Capes and demanded that a boarding party be allowed to search her for British deserters. The American captain refused and was fired upon. The Chesapeake, not properly outfitted and with a new crew, surrendered. The British boarded and took off 4 alleged deserters, one of whom they hanged. As a result of a national outrage, Great Britain had to pay reparations and return the other 3. This, more than any other single incident, ignited anti-British feelings that swept across the United States. Tensions were also rising on another front. Many Americans, especially frontiersmen, felt it imperative to occupy British North America before settlers could be free from Indian hostility. The cry, "On to Canada," spread from local taverns to the halls of Congress and from newspapers to pulpits. The cry was directed against the perceived threat of an unholy alliance between the British and the Indians. One newspaper commented,
"It is essentially necessary that Upper Canada should be the object of attack in order to exterminate, at one bold, determined blow, the horde of remorseless Great Britain did not recognize the right of British deserters to become naturalized Americans."
The saying was,
"Once an Englishman, always an Englishman."
Savages and their inhuman abettors, whose massacres and barbarous murders have lacerated the feeling heart and aroused the vengeance of an injured country. Furthermore, some Americans harboured a growing fear that Canada would serve as a base for British encroachment southward into the interior of the continent, girdling the United States to the Atlantic seaboard. The conquest of Canada could be of supreme importance to us in distressing our enemy. By cutting off provisions and naval stores for their West India colonies and beyond, many Americans believed the only way to bring about eventual peace was through expulsion of the British from Canada and creation of a North America free from foreign influence. As a pro-war, nationalistic newspaper declared, "War with Britain
would have a powerful effect in weaning the people of the United States from what some yet regard the mother country. It will teach our citizens a most important truth, that they have a country, and cause them to look to themselves instead of extending their views across the Atlantic for sources of happiness."
By December 1808, it seemed the United States was on the brink of hostilities with Britain. President Jefferson assumed that British military forces garrisoned at Halifax were ready to sail to the West Indies and threaten New Orleans if American troops invaded Canada. Both he and his cabinet calculated that the British intended to hold the city as a bargaining chip for whatever territory might be lost by such an attempt. Jefferson decided to reinforce the vulnerable American defenses on the Mississippi and ordered the disreputable Major General James Wilkerson, commanding the Southern Department of War, to assemble his troops near New Orleans to repel any such threat. The 51-year-old Wilkinson, ostentatious and of enormous presence, had developed a reputation for intrigue with the Spanish in Mexico. As an accomplice of the equally disreputable Aaron Burr, he had lent a favourable ear to Burr's dazzling schemes to invade Mexico and create their own republic, independent of the United States. When the cabal fizzled, he professed innocence and turned witness against his erstwhile colleague. Jefferson, perhaps against his better judgment, still entrusted this shadowy figure with high command. Not all the officers accompanying this expedition were so disposed. Lieutenant Colonel Electus Backus formerly commanded the 4th New York Militia Regiment of the Upper Hudson region. Born in Connecticut in 1768, but at an early age moved with his family to New York State. At the age of 14, he served in the Revolutionary War as a volunteer seeing action on the Hudson River against British troops near Peekskill, New York. The action was within a few weeks of more than 1,000 men became ill, deserted or perished. Attempting to preserve the demoralized army, Backus moved the surviving troops to higher grounds at Natchez, while Wilkinson remained safely quartered in New Orleans, accompanied by one of his favorite Creole beauties. Brigadier General Wade Hampton, who personally detested Wilkinson, ordered Backus to insignificant, but showed his proclivities toward his country. Backus served in the New York State Militia until joining the U.S. 1st Light Dragoons as he advanced to lieutenant colonel on February 15, 1809. He served under General James Wilkinson at Camp Terre aux Boeufs below New Orleans, whose army was decimated by disease, death, and mismanagement until it was forced to relocate to Natchez. Backus was one of the many taken ill, returning to his wife and 10 children at Greenville, New York, the following year to convalesce. He was subsequently a witness in the case against Wilkinson. At the beginning of the War of 1812, he assembled with the troops of his regiment at Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and marched them to Sackett's Harbor, where the remainder of this investigation takes place. The testimony he provided caused Wilkinson to be charged with irregularities in his accounts, namely, with having purchased inferior goods and pocketing the difference. Backus then served as one of the prosecution's chief witnesses in the 14-month-long court-martial. With considerable skill, Wilkinson convincingly placed the blame elsewhere and was acquitted. A senior, if sinister figure, he would eventually wreak more havoc on the fledgling American army. War did not erupt in Louisiana, but in the prevailing political atmosphere, Great Britain's tentacles were seen lurking everywhere. By the end of 1811, distrust and hostility reached a fever pitch in Congress. Henry Clay, Peter Porter, John C. Calhoun, and other war hawks clamoured for increased military preparation. They insisted the time had come to strike a blow for honour and country. Accordingly, the demoralized regular army was to be increased by 10,000 men, while the states were to provide 50,000 volunteers for federal service. If needed, state militias were to be mobilized, the navy strengthened with armed merchant ships and privateers, provided with letters of marque. Yet opinions respecting the drift towards war were a letter of marque authorized a privately owned armed merchant ship to seek out and capture enemy merchant vessels. A percentage of the value of the capture would go to the government, far from unanimous. The Federalists, particularly those from New England, feared the nation might not survive a prolonged contest with the world's leading naval power. An article in Niles' Weekly Register of Baltimore proclaimed,
"A declaration of war would be in effect a license and a bounty offered by our government to the British fleet to scour our coasts, to sweep our remaining navigation from the ocean, to annihilate our commerce, and drive the country into a state of poverty and distress. The proposed enemy is invulnerable to us while we are on all sides open to assault. The conquest of Canada would be less useful to us than that of Nova Zembla, and could not be so easily achieved."
The Democrat-Republicans, however, argued France would triumph over England in Europe. Now was the time to settle scores. One of the two main American political parties of the period favouring a strong centralized national government and amicable relations with Great Britain, nicknamed the English Party by the press, one of two major American political parties. favoured strict interpretation of the Constitution to restrict the powers of the federal government, emphasised states' rights and close relations with France, nicknamed the French Party by the press. As the national debate continued, attention shifted not on whether war was to be declared, but on how it was to be waged. On paper, if not in reality, the conquest of Canada appeared deceptively easy. About 7.2 million people lived in the United States of 1812, compared to only 650,000 in Upper and Lower Canada combined. The United States Army was authorized at 11,700 regulars of all ranks. However, only some 6,700 could be mustered. These troops were under the command of two aging major generals, Henry Dearborn and Thomas Pinckney, but a functional chain of command had yet to materialize. Strategy making was an ad hoc arrangement that involved the President, the Secretary of War, as well as the senior field officers and naval commanders. Their roles were never properly defined or understood. Therefore, the strategy they developed lacked both cogency and coordination. By the summer of 1812, the British had about 7,000 regular troops to defend Upper and Lower Canada. Out of a global force of 250,000, this was a mere fraction of their strength. Of 11,000 militia in Upper Canada, only 4,000 were considered trustworthy. The rest were recent immigrants from the United States. Governor Tompkins predicted that as many as 1/2 of the militia would join our standard. According to Congressman Peter Porter from western New York, Canada possessed only a force of 6,000 regulars stationed at Quebec and about 20,000 militia, not well organized, armed, or disciplined. As Great Britain was preoccupied by Napoleon, a military campaign to seize Canada seemed a mere matter of marching, but the war hawks failed to realize their own weakness. The American militia would have been a useless component of any invading army because of poor discipline, bad equipment, and unresolved constitutional questions regarding chain of command. There was even a question as to whether or not the militia could be deployed outside respective state borders. Because of the absence of national draft laws, most militiamen served under the authority of state governors. Even if this had not been the case, constitutional, financial, logistical, and tactical considerations ruled out the creation of a mass citizen army. To defeat the tough, regular British Army in Canada, the United States required a well-trained army and navy deployed on the frontier and ready to move. Such a force, however, was lacking in the political, economic, ideological, and social environment in the United States during this period. Military tensions along the northern frontier worsened. With the passage of the Embargo Act, a detachment of American troops under Lieutenant Joseph Cross, Regiment of Artillery, was posted at Sackett's Harbour in 1808. Lieutenant Cross informed British authorities at Kingston that he planned to station troops at Carleton Island. In response, the British replied they intended to retain possession of the island and sent a reinforcement to strengthen the post. Instructions were issued that if the Americans seized it, no counterattack should be made. The settlement of any such incident should be left to negotiations between the two governments. As relations with the United States deteriorated, a party of Royal Engineers was dispatched from Kingston to Carleton Island in the summer of 1808 to destroy a number of guns or bring them back to Kingston. Because the guns were so heavy and difficult to move, the engineers sank them in deep water, where they could not be easily recovered. As a further precaution, the British took steps to erect a blockhouse in Kingston. The construction programme and the growth of the fleet made the town more vital than ever before. Meanwhile, the Royal George, laid up in 1811, had her armament mounted early in 1812. In the event of war, one swift blow by an American force against Kingston, the British realised, could destroy British naval supremacy on Lake Ontario and thus jeopardise all of Upper Canada. Consequently, they took steps to prevent this from happening. In the spring of 1812, Major General Dearborn created a plan to invade Canada. This distinguished but now heavy, unwieldy-looking veteran of the Revolutionary War proposed to establish headquarters near Albany, granting easy access to Lake Champlain, Sackett's Harbour and the Niagara frontier. Once war broke out, Dearborn would conduct the main advance against the strategic city of Montreal by way of Plattsburgh, on Lake Champlain. As a young officer, Dearborn was courageous and able, but his period in command of the northern frontier in the War of 1812 was marked by delay, miscalculation, and a lack of sound judgment. Forces as far west as the Great Lakes would be cut off from military supplies and reinforcements. The enemy would then have little recourse but to capitulate. Simultaneously, other armies, primarily composed of militia, were to invade Upper Canada from Detroit and across the Niagara River from New York State. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, was to create a fleet to ensure control of Lake Ontario. Once accomplished, army units could be transported across the lake to capture British headquarters at Kingston. Once United States forces controlled Upper Canada, Dearborn felt the Indians would quickly be subdued. The general had developed what appeared to be a sound plan, at least on paper.
Waging war is very difficult, but the difficulty is not that erudition and great talent are needed. There is no great art to devising a good plan of operations. The entire difficulty lies in this: to remain faithful in action to the principle we have laid down for ourselves.
Von Clausewitz. If one believed the rhetoric of the Democrat-Republicans, there would be no lack of enthusiastic volunteers available for the conquest of Canada. 33-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Zebulon Montgomery Pike of New Jersey was one offering to serve on an expedition to Canada. Pike, a career officer since 1799, was an aggressive and professional soldier who evinced concern about the training and welfare of his troops. He had already gained fame for his explorations of the Mississippi and New Mexico territories. Because of this renown, he was an officer who could be envisioned as a herald to arouse the nation's spirit for the war effort. In time, his name would become indelibly associated with Sackett's Harbour. Once war broke out, it would be folly to contend with Britain on the high seas. The United States possessed a Lilliputian fleet of 20 warships, of which only one, the Oneida, was on Lake Ontario. She also had 170 fragile and useless gunboats, which were no match for Britain's 994-ship navy. So it was foolish to believe the U.S. could invade the British Isles, though Jefferson had at one time considered hiring arsonists to torch British cities. The U.S. possessed several well-constructed frigates, all on the Atlantic seaboard, that were superior to Himmler-class British ships, but they were no match for the numerous and powerful British ships of the line. The task assigned to the U.S. Navy on Lake Ontario was a difficult one. Here Britain's naval force consisted of 5 ships and schooners mounting a total of 70 guns. Lieutenant Woolsey dispatched a list of these vessels and their probable armament to Navy Secretary Paul Hamilton. The largest vessel was the Royal George, with 22 18-pounder carronades, the Earl of Morea to carry 14 9-pounder long guns. The schooners, the Duke of Gloucester and the Simcoe, together carried 26 6-pounders, as well as 2 or 3 more schooners capable of 8 6-pounder long guns each. He was under the impression that only the Royal George was equipped, officered, and at least partly manned. Furthermore, Wolsey learned that authorities in Kingston were making preparations for the defence of Upper Canada, and that a number of guns had recently been shipped there. A South Carolina plantation owner, usually drunk by noon, Hamilton, and incompetent, had little knowledge of naval affairs. Because of his personal relationship to the president, he held this key position until Madison reluctantly accepted Hamilton's resignation in December 1813. Wolsey then drew up a list of American merchant vessels on the lake capable of being pressed into service in the event of war. The largest, the Charles and Anne, he hoped would carry 12 18-pounder carronades. Two smaller schooners, the Fair American and Diana at Oswego, as well as the Niagara and Ontario at Fort Niagara. And at Ogdensburg there was the Collector, Experiment, and Genesee's packets, and all would be armed with long 6-pounders each. Besides these, there was the schooner, Julia, of about 50 tons, that had been recently launched at Oswego. Wolsey intended to mount the long 32-pounder originally planned for the Oneida on her. In the autumn of 1811, Wolsey requested the owners of all American merchant vessels to bring them to Sackett's Harbour for protection. Once there, they would be laid up for the winter. Then, in case of war, the British, whom Wolsey described as zealous and alert, would be unable to capture them. By early winter, most of the Oneida's crew had been recruited in New York City from hardy Atlantic sailors. Sailing by gunboat to Albany, these experienced tars continued their journey overland to Lake Ontario, while a detail of marine recruits accompanied them to prevent desertion. Once on station, these leathernecks were attached to the gun-brig as a guard. They were without weapons, ammunition, or uniforms. To avoid delays, their clothing and equipment was shipped directly to Sackett's Harbour as it became available. By April 20th, 1812, Lake Ontario was free of ice and open for navigation. If the differences between the United States and Great Britain were not amicably settled, Wolsey was determined to have the Oneida prepared for war. 300 cannonballs for the 32-pounder at Oswego were ordered and shot, for the guns was loaded on the merchant vessels. At Sackett's Harbour, work began on a blockhouse on the bluff overlooking the lake. Wolsey hoped to complete the crew of the Oneida from local volunteers. Because smuggling activities were spiralling, customs officials urged Wolsey to watch all vessels bound for Cape Vincent, as anything shipped to this small border settlement at the source of the St. Lawrence River was eventually intended for the illegal Canadian market. By early June, the efficient Wolsey had the Oneida and her crew prepared for any eventuality. It was well that Wolsey did, for on June 1st, 1812, after repeated efforts to arrive at a diplomatic settlement, President Madison sent his war message to Congress.